Hello, Pickled Onion Knight here with more of my Collect, Emulate and Avoid series. Now we're still in Generation 6 and I'm going to talk about the GameCube. Now, I'm not expecting this to be a long video. In fact, I expect this will probably only take about 10-15 minutes to do. Maybe a little longer, but we'll see how we get on. And the reason for that is because there's not much to say. Hopefully you've seen the Dreamcast video I did. Now, I'm sort of changing the format these videos work, just to briefly explain. There's no real point in me going into the history behind the console and, you know, stuff that was going on at various companies that led to the existence and the way the console was marketed and blah, 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 blah. A, because I don't think it's particularly interesting to anyone that wants to collect it now, and B, largely because the internet was around at that time. There's plenty of archive of what was going on. Nothing is a mystery anymore. You don't need me to explain it, and anything that does need to explain has already been explained in depth by multiples of other people. You don't need me adding anything to that party. So all I'm going to talk about really is the hardware, the accessories and the software, and to be honest, that doesn't take an awful long time. Now, the one thing that is going to be particularly different about this video is I am probably going to give my verdict in the middle of the video rather towards the end, because I already know roughly what I'm going to say. I have it written down here, and my verdict's going to come in the middle after I've explained why I've reached that verdict, and then there's going to be a little bit at the end that kind of muddies the waters a little bit. So, you know, this is going to be a departure in format specifically for this video out of the whole playlist. And if you have been watching the videos that are at the beginning of the playlist, well, fair play on you. You're a bigger man than I. Right, so let's do the thing that I always do, which is go through the basic models that you can buy. Now, the first two models there was a purple one and there was a black one. The purple one is the children's lunchbox version, and to be fair, it does look very childish. And then there's a black one, which is the sort of mature version. And then later on there came a silver one, and that is true for Europe and the US. Both of those things are true. In Japan, however, they got a lot more different. They got different styles, but they were all basically the same thing, just in different colours. Now, there is an anomaly in the range. Well, actually, there's two anomalies in the range, but one of them I won't come till to the end, because there's actually a prop in this video which is unusual as well. So this is going to be a standout video. There are two anomalies to this. One is the Panasonic Cube, which is a Japanese exclusive, and that is basically a GameCube with a DVD player in it. Why that's a good idea I might get onto later, but it's very obvious why that's a good idea. Although it was exclusive to Japan, they didn't make many of them, and it is hideously expensive if you want one. Also, the region lockouts are not a good idea. So yeah, it's region locked to Japan basically, and you have to get in and fiddle if you want to change that. Well, kind of. So aside from the main console hardware, there's another piece of hardware that I want to focus on, and that is the GameCube Player. Now, had this thing been marketed properly at the time, I dare say you would have saw the GameCube being a bit more successful than it was. the trouble was it wasn't really. You only really sort of knew about it if you already had a GameCube, because the only place I ever remember seeing, aside from actually being in a game shop, the only place I ever remember seeing it advertised was in Nintendo magazines. So you had to have already had a Nintendo console, really, to know that this thing existed at the time. Although this is probably the most sought after, in fact it is the most sought after accessory now if you own an actual GameCube, is the Game Boy Player. Not just the Game Boy Player though, you can pick them up fairly cheap as they are, hardware only, but you need the software disc that comes with it, and that's the important thing. A Game Boy Player on its own you could probably pick up for less than a tenner. Got the software disc for it? Well, depending on condition, the sky's the limit, quite frankly. The discs are harder to find than the actual hardware, for obvious reasons. People lose discs. It's quite difficult to lose a piece of hardware. But the good thing is as well, unlike a lot of add-ons, like notably, Sega add-ons, really, I'm talking about, you don't need an extra plug. And even things like the 64DD, if you wanted one of them, can't imagine why you would. You still need an extra power supply for that. The Game Boy Player, you don't. You literally plug it in, stick the software on the top, and bang, you can run your Game Boy Advance games, your Game Boy Color games, and your original Game Boy games. So fantastic. Kind of. Like I say, there's a lot of issues with trying to find that software disc, and in fact the software disc that comes bundled with it doesn't do that good a job of actually playing the Game Boy Advance games properly. You can go and get extra software to do that, which you can download online, but you still need that original disc in order to then run the better version of the software that runs the Game Boy games properly, if you're following me. Which you're probably not, but anyone that's into GameCube will know this already. So I mean, if you're the sort of person that already owns a Game Boy Player and knows what its capabilities should have been out of the box, then you know what I'm talking about. Now, even though all the different colours of console look pretty much the same, there are differences between them. In the first version of the hardware, they have what's called digital AV out. Now, this won't mean much to most people, but what that basically means is there's a very expensive type of cable you can buy called a component cable. Now, for most things, they're not that expensive. You can, for like if you have a PlayStation 2, the component cables are very cheap. For most other consoles, component cables are very cheap and very reachable. But if you buy them for the GameCube, you need the first model that has digital AV out for a kickoff, which is much more common in the US than it is in Europe. I mean, Europe did get it, and it was on the first generation of GameCube, but they didn't make many of them for the European market. So, probably 1 in every 3 GameCubes you find at boot sales in Britain will have the digital AV out. Even if you do have it, these cables are very expensive. Now, I'm given to understand that that's due to some sort of Nintendo proprietary control chip that is in the cable, which people can't replicate. So you couldn't go to like Console Cables or something like that and they've got third-party versions of this. There's only the Nintendo one, and that's it. So that is a major issue, but that is the best way to get your GameCube playing on a modern television. So now that we've got that sort of carry on out of the way, so we've already talked about 2 of the most expensive things for the console, and that is the Game Boy Player with software and the expensive, very, very expensive component cable, which requires a specific version of the console, the first version, if you like. So what hardware-wise is getting a bit cheaper? Well, The controllers. Oh no, hang on, they're not so cheap. No, there are two controllers. There's a standard controller that comes with the console, the GameCube controller. Now, this is a fantastic controller. If you've ever used one, what sort of person hasn't by this point, they are such good controllers, in fact, that people still want to use them now. There are people literally hacking their Switches in order to use GameCube controllers on the Switch. This is how popular and comfortable and nice these controllers are, the GameCube controllers. So they're not cheap. Even second-hand, they will probably set you back about 20 quid. Unless you find them, in the back of an Oxfam or something, you're not going to get GameCube controllers for cheap. Even more expensive is the Wavebird controller, because it's wireless and it's not, it's not horrible infrared wireless. It is proper RF wireless. And even if you find the controller, you need the receiver for it, which again is probably harder to find than the controller. So that's not cheap hardware. Right. Memory cards. Oh no, hang on, they're not so cheap either. So this is the other thing you'll need as well, is GameCube memory cards. And they're not overly expensive, but to be fair, there are at least third-party versions of GameCube memory cards that will do a perfect job of doing what memory cards are supposed to do. The branded Nintendo ones, however, they're still quite expensive. So if you want the original first-party stuff, still quite expensive. So where does that leave us? Basically, it leaves us with this: the only cheap hardware for the GameCube is the actual console itself, and even then only the second version of it, because that's the least sought after versions. Doesn't really matter about what colour you've got, but the second version is going to be the cheapest version, and you could probably find them on boot sales up and down the land going for no money at all, maybe even a £5 if you're lucky. Everything else, hardware wise, you're going to need for this console, in order to play games on this console, unfortunately you're going to have to take your wallet in. And like I say, the controllers, standard and Wavebird, are still so sought after. In fact, it does tell you how sought after they are when even the adapters to use these controllers on a Wii U were being scalped on eBay for, some of them, hundreds of pounds, because you couldn't get them. Not so much in the UK, because Nintendo tends to be quite good to us of late, and our stores tend to be filled. But I know certainly in North America it was a massive problem trying to get the adapters to use GameCube controllers on a Wii U, and people had terrible trouble trying to get hold of these things. So that does speak to the popularity and the build quality of these controllers for the GameCube. Now, supposedly there's this issue with the yellow stick, the yellow analog stick, not being particularly well built on these controllers, but me personally, I've never found it a problem. I've got a few GameCube controllers and they all work perfectly well as the day I got them. So now down to the games. There's actually quite a lot. Oh, the other thing I do want to mention about the hardware is, because I did mention this region issue when I was talking about the Panasonic Cube. Now, NTSC cubes tend to work well with one another. So, i.e., if you have something like the Action Replay disc, and you live in either North America or Japan, then if I have a North American GameCube and I put in my North American Action Replay disc, and some witchcraft happens, then it's very easy for me to play a Japanese game. Not so much with either the PAL games or the PAL version of consoles trying to get the NTSC games to play, because again we run into this 50-60 hertz issue, and some of the games don't play properly. Now I'm not going to give you a comprehensive list of which games and in which various ways they don't play properly. Just trust me, if you have a PAL console, it's best to stick to the PAL games unless you can actually get the console hardware modified. Using an action replay disc will let you boot up NTSC games, but some of them won't work properly in certain instances. But if you have an NTSC version of the console, like if you have the US version of the console, Japanese games should be a doddle, just using a software switching and things like that. So that's just one thing I want to add before I move on to the games. Now, the trouble with the GameCube is the games are getting very expensive. There's no other way to put it. Anything that's console exclusive is going to cost you your wallet. It really is. Even stuff that didn't quite work on the console, like there's a lot of Resident Evil games on the GameCube that don't quite work on the console as they do in some of the other places they've been, and they're still expensive. The 4-game Zelda disc that came out, which was marked as promotional, that had Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Majora's Mask and other things on it, that's very expensive. Pretty much everything that's a console exclusive for the GameCube is expensive. There's no real exception to that. And to be fair, if you're collecting for the GameCube, that's pretty much all you're going to want anyway, because the trouble is, the way the hardware was designed, it was on these sort of smaller discs, like these 8cm discs, that Nintendo decided to use as a proprietary format. Now, they're not quite DVD, or at least they're not in the same format as DVD that all the other consoles were going on to use at this point. And I think that was a mistake. I think why Nintendo have done it is basically to stop piracy. That's exactly why they've done that. There's no other way about it, because they could have fit a full-size disc in the console. There's a slight redesign and they could have done it. Now what this means is for anything that came out multi-platform, was because of the amount of space that you could fit on these GameCube discs compared to what you could fit on a standard size DVD, it meant that anything multi-platform had to be smaller. So anything that came out anywhere else, you were always going to get the superior version somewhere else. So it basically means that anything that came out multi-platform is going to be smaller, or alternatively, something had to be developed specifically with the GameCube hardware and the discs in mind. So it basically means you're sort of in two camps here. Is it good to have a multi-platform, to buy a multi-platform game on the GameCube? Well, no, it's not. But what it does mean is that all the collectors, and without exception, are only going for the exclusive games, which means it pushes the price of the exclusive games up, perhaps far higher than they should be. And you do get into this situation where even the worst games on the console are still commanding quite a high price, because that's what people want, is they want the exclusive games, because by and large they weren't anywhere else and never will be. because anything that's exclusive to the GameCube was made specifically with the GameCube in mind. It will never be. There's no real way for it to be ported anywhere else, or no real reason, perhaps. So this takes us to the middle of the video, where I'm going to give my verdict. Collect, emulate, avoid. Well, don't avoid, and 9 times out of 10 I would say don't collect, unless you've got deep pockets. Everything you buy, I mean, aside from the actual console itself, everything you buy is going to be expensive or more. It's basically, for this console, unfortunately, and this is at the moment, as of November 2017, it's an inflated marketplace. You know, you could take your chance and maybe wait for the market to die down, maybe wait for the interest to die off. But especially when it comes to stuff like the Game Boy Player, they're only going to go up in price because even more people are going to lose that software disc, and the thing is completely useless without it. As for the controllers, like I say, people are trying to they're fiddling around with the Switch software to try and get GameCube controllers to work on it, so that's probably a no-go. They're probably going to go up in price as well. That's standard and the Wavebird. Memory cards will probably come down in price as less and less people need them. So that might be the only thing, but like I say, don't think about collecting this console unless you've got a little bit of financial clout behind you to do it. Otherwise you're going to be very disappointed. You're going to be sitting on a stack of 2 or 3 games that aren't very good, or you're going to be sitting on a stack of the dozen or so multi-platform games that are on the system, that knowing full well that the better version of the game that you've got is on a different system, because that's just how it works. Emulate, luckily, that's very easy to do. Now, there's 2 ways you can go about this. Number 1 is on your PC, and number 2, this is where I'm going to throw the prop into the ring. And this leads back to the hardware variants I was talking about at the beginning, and I'm going to show you my GameCube. This is a hardware variant that I haven't mentioned yet, but I'm going to show you now. This is my GameCube here. It's a Nintendo Wii. Now, before you jump on me in the comments section, I am well aware. Let me just explain. When I say emulation, this technically, depending on what side of the fence you're on, this will either count as emulation or not. Because what the Wii is effectively a GameCube on steroids, is what it is. Most of the hardware in this console is very similar. It's basically an updated version of the hardware that's in the GameCube. But there's an advantage to using this. So this is and this only applies, by the way, to the first generation Wii that has these on the side. See, this is a GameCube compatible Nintendo Wii. This is the first version of the Wii, and probably, certainly in the UK, probably the most common version as well. So that's good. But as you can see there's your full controller ports, there's your memory card slots, and this disk drive is compatible with all the GameCube games. The other advantage to using a Wii to play your GameCube games is that you don't need to mess about finding ridiculously expensive component cables and a particular version of a console to use with them. This uses component cables out of the box. The other good thing, I will probably go more in depth in this when I actually come to do the Nintendo Wii as part of this, but you can actually buy a HDMI adapter for this that just plugs in the back where the component cables would go, and effectively what you're doing is you're making a 720p Wii. It's not actually that simple, but your TV is fooled enough that there is a noticeable difference. I think so anyway, or I'm fooled enough that there's a noticeable difference. So this is my GameCube here. The other advantage, the only disadvantage to using one of these is that obviously you can't have the Game Boy Player. But if you're already in the mood for emulation anyway, there's a card slot on the front here, and you can program that up with all sorts of gubbins that you could just play Game Boy ROMs anyway. So if you were that worried about playing Game Boy games, you actually can do it with this console as well, only in a slightly greyer fashion. But that's what I wanted to leave you with, is that basically the only advantage really to using a Wii is to get that component signal out of it. Everything else, again, is still going to cost you a fortune. So, like I say, you can either go down the more traditional emulation route of using a PC, but even then, you'd probably still want to buy a USB adapter and use actual GameCube controllers, because honestly they are, I think I wouldn't say they're my favourite controller, because I really like the PlayStation 4 controllers. I quite like the Xbox controllers for using on the PC, but they probably come third, maybe fourth in the list of my favourite controllers. They really are good controllers, and I don't think I'm alone in this, like I say, considering how long the controllers have been in demand for and still continuously are in demand. So you'd probably still want to do that even if you're running it on a PC. So the Wii, but like I say, the need for controllers isn't really solved at any point, no matter which way you decide to do this, but you're still left with the expensive games. Now, some of them did get, if you're going to go down the route of using a Wii anyway, some of the GameCube games did get Wii ports. So that's a thing, and generally speaking, the Wii version of anything that did get ported across is going to be cheaper than the GameCube equivalent. So anything that got updated for the Nintendo Wii is probably going to be the better equivalent of the game to get. But if you genuinely want to collect this, yeah, you're really going to need your wallet. So that's basically the caveat to my verdict on this. So this is basically what I've decided to do. Now, I don't collect for GameCube. I think I've got maybe 1 or 2 games, and I never really play them. But if I do, I play them on the Wii. I don't own a GameCube. Although obviously it's not difficult to own a GameCube because you can find them everywhere. You know, they're just so. The actual GameCube hardware itself, you're not going to have trouble finding. It's all the other stuff that you need is going to cause you the major issue and the headaches. So what I would basically advise is don't go out of your way. Well, the advice I'm going to give to anyone watching is the same advice I've given to myself. You know, is I've decided to go down the route of, I've got a Wii. I really like the Wii. Now, I know a lot of people don't, but I really do. I've got the GameCube compatible version. Hence, I have got a couple of memory cards, third-party ones, admittedly, not the Nintendo ones because they're expensive, to go in there. I don't own any Wavebird controllers because I don't really care for wirelessness. But I do own GameCube controllers specifically to use on the Wii. Also, they're compatible with a lot of Wii games. I'm not too fussed about not having the Game Boy Player. I'm not particularly interested because I don't have an awful lot of Game Boy games anyway. And most of the ones I do have will work on the Super Game Boy because they're the original Game Boy games and they work on the Super Game Boy. And every now and then, if I come across a GameCube game cheap enough, I know I can take it home and play it on the Wii, which I can then plug in, rather than spending 300 quid on a GameCube component cable to plug into my fancy HD TV. I can spend 5 quid on a Wii component cable to plug into my fancy HD TV, or if I'm feeling really frisky about it, I can use a Wii to HDMI adapter and just plug the HDMI cable straight in there. So that's basically, that's my advantage for this, is how I've decided to approach it. Yes, I will pick up the odd GameCube game if I find one cheap enough, but frankly I don't care. And just because it's so expensive. You know, it is so expensive to collect for GameCube games. It's getting to the point where they are, I won't say they're getting rarer than Super Nintendo games, because that's ridiculous, but I probably see cheaper N64 games before I see cheaper GameCube games, and that's not really the way that the market's supposed to go. You know, I thought the N64 stuff would go up a lot sharper, but it sort of hasn't. I mean, I'm specifically talking about Britain. I don't know what the market's like for second-hand games, really, most other places in the world. But the GameCube stuff seems to have spiked like nobody's business. Yeah, and that's it. That's basically the end of this video, is that collect if you must, but be sort of clever about it, and perhaps only buy the hardware you need. Don't really think about the GameCube player as part of your collection, because that, like I say, with the software is going to set you back a few quid, unless you're so lucky that you actually come across one with the Game Boy player that nobody, you know, the person selling it doesn't have a clue what they've got on their hands, in which case, yep, you should definitely count yourself lucky, but also you're an evil person. You know, they probably need that money to feed their family, you know, and you've basically conned them out of 300 quid. What are you, you monster? But yeah, that's it. That's the end of the video, and I hope by in a GameCube video going, ooh wee, I hope I haven't upset too many people. But quite frankly, if you're dyed-in-the-wool die-hard GameCube fans, I imagine you spend most of your life being upset anyway, so I haven't really added to your misery, you know. And that's it. That's the end of this video. That's my verdict, and I'm sticking to it. So, quite possibly, the next one... No, the next video in Generation 6 is going to be either PS2 or Xbox. I will probably do Xbox first. Yeah, I probably will. Xbox will probably be the next one, and PS2 will be the last one, because I think the last one should be the one that won the generation. So, and that is PS2. You can't argue with that. So I think the Xbox one will be next. It may not be for a little while though. Probably at least a few weeks, because I haven't finished writing it. It's basically it. I have to get on with doing that. So that's the end of the video, and as usual, you know, the comment section is there for you to have your own 2 cents worth, although do bear it in mind, if I think you're getting too vicious, I will just delete your comment. So, you know, if you've got a point to make it nicely, because if you're just being a troll, I'm going to delete your comment and nobody will see it anyway. So that's how that works. Twitter's there if you need an alternative to that. And hopefully at the side here 2 little videos have popped up that you might be interested in. There should be a subscribe button here if you're interested in subscribing and seeing anything else that I've done. And other than that, I will see you in another video. I've been the Pickled Onion Knight, and I hope you've been informed.